On October 31st, 2002, Chris Jenkins went out to celebrate Halloween with friends at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in Minneapolis. He was dressed in a costume and was accompanied by his girlfriend and another couple. Around midnight, Jenkins was reportedly ejected from the bar by bouncers. In the process, he became separated from his friends and left behind his coat, wallet, and cell phone inside the bar on a cold night. A bouncer saw him walk away from the bar, turning left onto Hennepin Avenue, but after that point, Chris vanished into the darkness. When he didn't return home, his family and friends grew alarmed, and a massive search effort began. For days and then weeks, volunteers and police searched for any sign of Chris. Sadly, nearly 4 months later, on February 27, 2003, a body recovery team found Chris Jenkins's remains in the Mississippi River. His body had become snagged on debris near the 3rd Avenue Bridge not far from St. Anthony Falls in Minneapolis. Chris was still wearing his Halloween costume when his body was discovered. An autopsy determined the cause of death to be drowning, but investigators couldn't initially determine how it happened. With no obvious signs of severe trauma and a blood alcohol level above the legal limit in his system, police theorized that Chris's death was likely a tragic accident, or even his own work. They suggested he might have become intoxicated and fallen from a nearby bridge into the river, perhaps upset after an argument with his girlfriend earlier in the evening. By 2004, the Minneapolis Police Department had closed the case, concluding that no foul play was involved. To Chris's family, however, this conclusion was unacceptable. They felt that critical evidence had been overlooked and that the investigation was prematurely closed. The Jenkins family never believed Chris's death was an accident. Chris was a well-liked, responsible student with a promising future, and not someone who they believed was prone to reckless behavior or thoughts of going out voluntarily. Disturbed by what they saw as missteps in the investigation, his parents, Jan and Steve Jenkins, undertook their own efforts to find the truth. They hired private investigators and even independent experts to analyze the evidence. For example, one investigator found witnesses who reported seeing a group of men involved in an altercation outside a pizza shop across from the bar around the time Chris left. Their forensic experts noted that the condition of Chris's body was unusual for a drowning. He was found lying on his back with his arms crossed, his shirt still neatly tucked in, and even his slip-on shoes still on his feet. According to their forensic experts, typically, drowning victims are found face down with disheveled clothing and often missing shoes due to the struggle in water. To the Jenkins family, these details indicated that Chris may not have perished from an accidental fall into the river, but rather that his body had been placed in the water after death. In 2006, a new Minneapolis police chief took over leadership in the city and agreed to review the case at the family's urging. Around the same time, a breakthrough seemed to occur. Detectives received a tip from a jailhouse snitch who claimed to have knowledge of Chris's death. This informant told police that he and another man had encountered Chris on a pedestrian walkway of the Hennepin Avenue Bridge and targeted him for a robbery. According to this account, Chris was an easy target because he was intoxicated and alone. When they found he had no valuables on him, one of the perpetrators became enraged and flung Chris over the railing of the bridge into the river. Based on this new information, the police chief officially reopened the investigation. On November 17, 2006, Minneapolis police held a news conference to announce that Chris Jenkins's manner of death was being reclassified as a slaying. With the case now treated as foul play related, investigators followed the new leads. They interviewed the jailed informant and searched for the other suspect mentioned in the bridge scenario. However, this line of investigation ran into problems. For one, the physical logistics of the alleged crime were questionable. The Hennepin Avenue Bridge has fairly high railings, and a single person throwing a strong, healthy young man over it would be difficult, though clearly not impossible. However, it was speculated that perhaps the jailhouse snitch had been more involved than he had let on to investigators, and that perhaps both men threw him over. However, the authorities would discover there was yet another problem. The Hennepin Avenue Bridge has a clearance of approximately 40 feet above the Mississippi River. Chris's autopsy revealed no broken bones or major injuries that one might expect from being dropped from significant heights. Forensic experts had significant doubts that his body wouldn't have experienced major trauma in such a fall. However, again, this didn't necessarily completely rule out the scenario. Doubts also arose because security cameras facing that bridge didn't show any altercation on the bridge on the night in question. Given that Chris disappeared after 2001, and given that the bridge was classified as critical infrastructure, there were numerous security cameras filming all angles of the bridge. Some investigators began to suspect that if Chris had been slain, it might have happened elsewhere, and his body was dumped in the river later, rather than directly thrown off that bridge. By 2007, police had a suspect's name and presented it to prosecutors. The Hennepin County Attorney's Office concluded there wasn't enough evidence to charge this suspect, or anyone else, in relation to Chris's case. To this day, the case remains open and unsolved, with investigators still hoping to find the evidence needed to ultimately hold someone accountable. In the absence of a definitive conclusion, a number of other theories have been proposed over the years to explain what might have happened to Chris Jenkins. And before I discuss it further, there are still people who remain unconvinced that this whole thing wasn't just an unfortunate drowning accident that took a young man too soon. Chris's family has advanced the theory that he was the victim of a more elaborate act of foul play that didn't involve an immediate fall from a bridge. They point to various pieces of evidence suggesting Chris was attacked near the bar shortly after he was kicked out, potentially knocked unconscious, and then transported to another location. The private investigator the family hired learned of a possible gang initiation happening outside a pizza restaurant across the street from the bar around the same time. The family theorizes that Chris could have been abducted in a van, held against his will, and possibly harmed for some time before his body was disposed of in the river. This would explain why his body appeared as if it had been placed gently in the water. That said, it doesn't explain why his body showed no signs of significant trauma. Jan Jenkins, Chris's mother, has speculated substantially about what happened to her son over the years, going beyond the abduction theory. For instance, she speculated that an off-duty police officer at the bar might have had a personal motive to orchestrate Chris's removal from the premises, to get access to his girlfriend. While this theory doesn't propose the officer was involved in the actual slaying, the theory is the involvement of a cop may have made the authorities quick to rule it an accidental death in 2023. She's also hinted at the disturbing possibility of a ritualistic or cult-related sacrifice, though this aspect remains highly speculative, to put it mildly. This appears to be largely based upon the fact that he disappeared on Halloween, and appears to be tied to the theory that he was abducted prior to being slain. Looking at the evidence from a strictly objective basis, the scenarios proposed by the family are very much speculative. That said, his family has speculated day in and day out as to what happened to him since Halloween 2022, and I'm sure they've run through absolutely every scenario imaginable. Another theory that was and is popular online is that he may be a victim of the so-called smiley face perpetrator. Without going down that rabbit hole, this is a highly speculative theory about a predator or group targeting young college-aged men. The theory is considered highly speculative, and Chris is one of the cases often cited in support of the pattern of this alleged perpetrator. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to actually resolve this case at this time. The authorities didn't treat this case as a slaying initially, and simply investigated it as an accidental drowning. In the nearly 4 years it took for them to reclassify the case, untold quantities of evidence went stale or expired. At present, we don't know who the suspect was or why the authorities refused to prosecute this individual, so it's unclear what evidence, if any, is needed to resolve this case. Launched in 1972, the MS München was a carrier ship owned by German shipping giant Hapag-Lloyd and designed to transport lighter barges across the ocean. And quick note for anyone unfamiliar, München is the German name for the city of Munich. On December 7, 1978, she departed Bremerhaven, Germany, en route to Savannah, Georgia, carrying 83 barges loaded with steel products and a crew of 28. By December 12th, the ship encountered a severe storm in the North Atlantic. Despite the harsh conditions, the ship was considered capable of withstanding such weather. However, in the early hours of December 12th, a distress signal was received, indicating the ship was in peril. The distress call prompted one of the largest search operations in maritime history. 13 aircraft and 110 ships from various nations scoured an area 5 times the size of Germany. The search was hampered by the severe weather and inaccurate positioning, delaying the rescue efforts. Over 10 days, searchers found only 3 barges, 4 unused lifeboats, 2 life jackets, and 2 life rings. Notably, one of the recovered lifeboats showed signs of significant damage. The pins securing it, located about 65 feet above the waterline, were bent backward, suggesting a massive force had torn it from its position. The official investigation concluded that an unusual event caused by severe weather led to the sinking. However, the exact nature of this event remained unclear. The damage to the lifeboat, positioned 65 feet above the waterline, led to speculation about the involvement of a rogue wave. At the time, rogue waves were considered rare and largely theoretical. The concept of such waves gained credibility after an 84-foot rogue wave was recorded in 1995, providing concrete evidence of their existence. This discovery led many to revisit the ship's disappearance, considering a rogue wave as a plausible cause. The theory suggests that the München could have encountered a rogue wave of up to 100 feet high. Such a wave could have overwhelmed the vessel, causing catastrophic damage and leading to its rapid sinking. The bent lifeboat pins support this hypothesis, indicating a forceful impact from above. Another theory suggests that the 83 barges on board the ship were to blame. If these barges broke loose in a storm and all shifted simultaneously, it's possible that this cargo shift could have caused the entire ship to capsize. A much more controversial theory suggests that the ship may have struck a NATO or Soviet submarine. Under this theory, the damage caused by the strike was covered up. At present, the rogue wave theory is considered to be by far the most likely. The ship's wreckage still remains below the sea, and if it were ever located, it's likely that the true cause of this mysterious maritime vanishing could be solved. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. In late August 2011, the quiet community of Chilliwack, British Columbia was shaken by a grim discovery. Corey Sherby, a 38-year-old logger, was found dead in his own living room by his mother after a weekend where he didn't contact any of his friends or family. He was discovered kneeling in front of his couch, head face down into the cushions, with a dark pool of blood dried on the floor. And look, I'm just going to state my bias right out of the gate here. This was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigation, and the RCMP seems to botch every other investigation they handle. On Monday, August 22, 2011, Gladys Sherby used her spare key to enter Corey's home after he hadn't answered calls for days. She walked into a scene no parent should ever face. Corey was on his knees with his upper body draped over the couch, unresponsive and cold. Startled and in panic, Gladys screamed and pulled her son onto the floor, noticing his face was ghostly white and that part of his scalp and ears appeared to be missing or damaged. The RCMP arrived and examined the scene. According to one of the first responders, there were no obvious signs of trauma, no indications of a struggle, and no forced entry into the house. Further, the autopsy confirmed the existence of lethal levels of coke and alcohol in his system. With that finding, the RCMP concluded that Corey's death was accidental and quickly closed the case without treating the home as a crime scene. Ed and Gladys, however, immediately felt that this conclusion was wrong. They knew their son to be health conscious and insisted that he didn't struggle with substances. To them, the idea that Corey had suddenly binged on a lethal combination of coke and alcohol was inexplicable. Moreover, the bizarre condition in which the body was found did not sit right with the family, or even some experts they consulted. Corey's body position, kneeling and slumped forward, didn't look like a natural resting position for someone who simply overdosed and passed away. The Sherbys began to suspect that something awful had happened to Corey that weekend, something that was being overlooked. One eerie clue was a cardboard box found in Corey's front hall closet, scrawled with the unsettling message, "Better be a funeral," in black marker. This cryptic phrase, discovered as the family was cleaning out the house, sent chills down their spines. It felt like a warning or threat left behind by whoever might have been involved in Corey's death. And it wasn't the only strange detail. As the family carefully went through the house, they noticed bloody footprints on the stairs and what looked like blood smeared on a door frame and splattered in various spots. These red stains hadn't been documented or explained by the police. Notably, as they were cleaning up the house, they also found a piece of his scalp on the floor, which they considered inconsistent with the official narrative. Ed also recalled that Corey's wallet, recovered at the scene, had a bloody fingerprint on it, and that approximately $140 in cash was missing from it. To the family, these details were alarming signs that pointed to a struggle or foul play. They couldn't shake the image of a violent encounter taking place in Corey's home. Another puzzling element was a person who might have been one of the last to see Corey alive. On the Friday before his body was found, August 19th, 2011, Ed Sherby had dropped by Corey's house around 9 p.m. to deliver some delicious hamburgers for the weekend. To his surprise, he saw an unknown woman in the house with his son. This woman, wearing a leather jacket and slippers, was not Corey's girlfriend, and Ed had never seen her before. Ed later recounted that he even remarked, half-jokingly, that he didn't know Corey had company, after which Corey walked him out of the house. That mysterious woman has never been identified, and police did not pursue finding out who she was at the time. Within days of Corey's death, yet another disturbing event deepened the family's suspicions. One early morning, a high school friend of Corey's named Tammy Borden showed up at Ed and Gladys's door, banging frantically and waking them up. Tammy was visibly upset, and in a trembling confession, claimed she knew Corey had been ended over money and illicit substances. She said there were a number of people involved, but ominously refused to name anyone, saying she feared for her own life. Before the Sherbys could learn more, Tammy fled. Tragically, only a few months later, in February 2012, Tammy Borden herself died under mysterious circumstances. Her sudden death, coming so soon after her cryptic warning, struck the Sherby family as too coincidental to ignore. It was as if anyone who knew something about Corey's case was being silenced by design. All of these odd clues and events convinced Ed and Gladys that the police's overdose theory didn't account for the full picture. In their eyes, the evidence hinted at a staged scene or a cover-up, and they were determined to push for a deeper investigation. On July 30th, 2012, about a year after Corey's death, Corey's uncle, Marty Jordan, wrote a detailed 5-page letter to the RCMP on behalf of the family. In this letter, Jordan formally complained about the quality of the investigation and urged the police to reopen the case. He listed the family's many concerns and the unanswered questions. The RCMP treated Marty Jordan's letter as a formal public complaint and conducted an internal review of the case. In June 2013, nearly 11 months after the complaint, the family received an 8-page response from the chief superintendent of the RCMP. This RCMP review essentially defended the initial investigation, concluding that the officers had done a thorough job. The response tried to explain away several of the suspicious details that the Sherbys had flagged. According to the response letter, the large pool of blood under Corey's body was not actually unusual. Rather, it was comprised of various bodily fluids that one would expect from a body that had been decomposing over a hot summer weekend. In other words, what the family interpreted as signs of violence might have simply been the unfortunate byproduct of a delayed discovery. The bloody footprints and smudges, the review claimed, were likely left by family members or the coroner's removal team when they first dealt with the body. As for the piece of Corey's scalp left behind, the RCMP acknowledged it as an unfortunate accident by the cleanup crew. It was also admitted that it was equally unfortunate that police hadn't informed the Sherbys about this quote-unquote mishap. These admissions did little to satisfy the family, and the official stance remained that Corey's death was a tragic self-inflicted accident. The family ended up hiring an independent forensic expert from the United States. This American medical doctor examined the available records and photographs and concluded that Corey likely died as a result of a violent altercation, not an overdose. Armed with this expert opinion, the Sherbys intensified their campaign for justice. They spoke to the media, resulting in multiple newspaper articles that kept Corey's story in the public eye. The Sherbys also reached out to police oversight bodies. They filed complaints with the Commission for Public Complaints against the RCMP, which at one point recommended that the RCMP do some further investigation into the case. In May 2019, British Columbia's Minister of Public Safety agreed that the case warranted this deeper public scrutiny and announced that he was holding a coroner's inquest. Over several days, the inquest at the Burnaby Coroner's Court heard from witnesses and reviewed evidence. The jury was presented with the forensic reports, the photographs of the scene, and accounts from both the initial investigators and those the family had later brought in. After careful deliberation, the coroner's jury returned their verdict on November 5th, 2020. In the end, they concluded that Corey Sherby's death was accidental, caused by acute coke and alcohol toxicity, exactly what the original autopsy had found. The inquest did not find sufficient evidence to reclassify the death as a slaying. However, the inquest jury did acknowledge the problems with the case. They made a single, pointed recommendation to the RCMP, suggesting that policies and procedures needed to be revised to collect all evidence in any death investigations. And yes, you heard me correctly. You don't need to rewind that one. They had to tell the RCMP, hey guys, perhaps you should collect evidence, rather than simply doing nothing. In essence, the jury recognized that the investigation in 2011 had likely missed or lost evidence, and they wanted the police to learn from this failure. Importantly, without properly collected contemporaneous evidence, the coroner's inquest essentially had its hands tied as to the conclusion. And it really seems like a self-fulfilling verdict to me. Since the RCMP only gathered enough evidence initially to prove it was an accidental overdose, the result of the inquest was, unsurprisingly, that it was accidental. Personally, I think there's significant reasons to think that Corey's death was suspicious. Now, of course, that doesn't actually mean there was any foul play involved. But still, Investigators owed it to him and his family to properly investigate the scene. Unfortunately, some detective got it in their mind that this was accidental and simply stopped meaningfully investigating at that point. Richie Edwards was the rhythm guitarist and one of the lyricists for the Manic Street Preachers, a Welsh alternative rock band that reached their cultural zenith in the 90s. On one morning in 1995, at the height of his fame, Richie vanished off the face of the earth. Richie Edwards had become well known for his provocative lyrics and intense persona. In fact, he penned the majority of the lyrics on the band's critically acclaimed 1994 album, The Holy Bible, a harrowingly personal record that reflected his troubled state of mind. Edwards was open about his mental health and substance struggles. These struggles were significant, and he spent time in hospitals throughout 1994 to address these problems. Despite these challenges, Edwards was often described as the heart and soul of the Manic Street Preachers, valued for his lyrical abilities and intellect. On the morning of February 1st, 1995, the day he was supposed to fly to the United States for a promotional tour, Edwards checked out of the Embassy Hotel in London at around 7 a.m. In the weeks before, he had withdrawn £2,800 in cash from his bank account for reasons unknown. When he departed the hotel, he took his wallet, car keys, and some prescribed medications, but left behind personal items like his packed suitcase and toiletries. He also left a gift-wrapped box addressed to his ex-girlfriend, filled with books, photographs, and a note that said, "I love you." This poignant package was interpreted by those close to him as a possible parting gesture. After leaving the hotel, Edwards drove west toward Wales. Later that day, he crossed the Severn Bridge, and after that point, all trace of him was lost. When Edwards failed to show up for the flight or make contact, the band's management grew alarmed. On February 2nd, 1995, after failing to get in touch with Richie for over a day, the band's manager filed a missing person report with the police. About 2 weeks later, on February 14th, Richie's car was discovered abandoned at the Severn View service station near the bridge. Evidence suggested the car had been lived in. The battery was dead, and items such as food wrappers and family photographs, taken by Edwards just days earlier, were found inside. Given the car's proximity to a notorious spot and Edwards' fragile mental state, many feared that he had jumped from the Severn Bridge into the river shortly after leaving his car. However, searches of the river and surrounding area at the time turned up no body or definitive evidence. The police investigation into Richie Edwards' disappearance was exhaustive, but ultimately inconclusive. Authorities carried out an extensive search, but turned up no concrete clues as to his fate. Investigators could reconstruct some of his movements up to the point where his car was found, but beyond the abandoned vehicle there was nothing to go on. Over the years, police and Edwards' family followed various tips and media leads, but none led to a breakthrough. With the case cold and no verified evidence of life, a court issued a presumption of death order in November 2008, officially declaring Edwards dead in absentia. This legal step allowed his family to settle his affairs, though it provided no answer to what actually happened to him. Several theories have been proposed to explain what might have happened to Richie Edwards. The most prevalent theory is that Edwards ended himself. His car's location by the Severn Bridge, a known site for this activity, and mental health and substance concerns supported this view. Yet without a body or definitive proof, this theory remains unconfirmed. Another theory is that Edwards intentionally vanished to start a new life away from the public eye. Proponents note that he withdrew a large amount of cash beforehand and left behind personal mementos, indicating possible planning. In the months and years following Edwards' disappearance, numerous alleged sightings of the missing musician were reported, but none could be verified. Early on, a few people in Wales thought they saw him. For example, A fan claimed to have spotted Edwards at a bus station in Newport in the days after he vanished. Later, more sensational reports came from overseas. There were alleged sightings in Goa, a state in India known for its beaches, and on the Canary Islands, suggesting that Edwards might have been living abroad. All of these leads proved fruitless, and police were never able to confirm any of the sightings. A less common theory claims that Edwards was the victim of foul play. This theory suggests he might have encountered someone who harmed him on or after February 1st, 1995. Proponents of this theory note that individuals suffering from mental breaks are at greater risk for violence, given their behavior is generally far outside the ordinary. However, investigators found no evidence of a struggle or third-party involvement at his hotel or with his abandoned car. No suspects or motives ever emerged. Given the absence of any supporting evidence, foul play is considered unlikely by most observers, though it cannot be entirely ruled out. In addition to his friends and family, Richie Edwards' disappearance profoundly affected the Manic Street Preachers and the music world more broadly. The band continued as a trio, and in 1996, they released the album Everything Must Go, which included several songs using lyrics Edwards had written before he went missing. Anyway, personally, while I would absolutely love to believe that Richie Edwards is alive and well and living his best life on a beach in Goa, the evidence doesn't seem to support this. Given the location where his vehicle was found, and given his mental health history, it appears nearly certain that he's unfortunately no longer with us. On the morning of October 3, 1972, a Southern Pacific Railroad work crew spotted smoke rising from a remote hillside near an Interstate 80 overpass outside Baxter, California. What they initially thought might be a brush fire or burning log turned out to be the smoldering body of an unidentified man wrapped in blankets. The Placer County Sheriff described the scene as a grisly slaying. The victim had apparently been beaten before being doused with a flammable liquid, wrapped in bedding, and set afire, his body then dumped by the roadside. The flames were still burning when the crew arrived, and an autopsy later confirmed the man had smoke in his lungs, indicating he was alive while being burned. This unknown victim would come to be known only as the Placer County John Doe. The forensic examination of the body revealed shocking evidence of neglect even before the slaying. Although the intense fire charred his remains, pathologists uncovered multiple injuries and health issues. The man had suffered a broken left arm roughly 6 to 8 weeks before death, which had never been set or treated. Several of his ribs were also broken, and he had a severe head injury inflicted within a day of death. Investigators found numerous bed sores on his back, suggesting he had been bedridden for an extended period. The bottoms of his feet were unusually smooth and soft, as if he had not walked in a long time or perhaps even ever. Despite being around 5 feet 10 inches, the man weighed only about 110 to 130 pounds. He appeared emaciated, indicating periods of prolonged malnourishment. Further, the victim's fingernails were grown out about 3/4 of an inch long, and his teeth were in extremely poor condition. A dentist who examined the teeth said it was doubtful the man had ever received dental care in his life. He was wearing only a white hospital-type gown and socks when found, indicating he may have come from a quote-unquote care facility setting. These findings painted a tragic picture. The John Doe appeared to have been a disabled, bedridden individual who suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to care for him. Investigators believed the victim couldn't fend for himself, making the cruelty of this case all the more disgusting. Sheriff's detectives immediately began working to identify the victim and find whoever was responsible. Because the John Doe had no identification and couldn't be matched to any recent missing person reports, investigators focused on the clues suggesting he had been under institutional care. The hospital gown, bed sores, and general condition led to early speculation that the man had recently been a patient in a hospital, nursing home, or long-term care facility. Detectives pursued this lead aggressively. Over 100 care facilities in California, Nevada, and neighboring states were contacted. No facility acknowledged a missing patient matching his description, however, and this avenue went cold. Other investigative efforts were equally exhaustive. Forensic attempts to identify the man were limited by the condition of the body. Fingerprints were difficult to obtain from his charred remains, though detectives managed to recover a single fingerprint. When they checked it against state and FBI databases of prints, no match was found. This one fingerprint and the victim's dental characteristics were recorded in case a future match might be possible. No personal items or unique identifiers were found with the body. However, one of the blankets used was a U.S. Army blanket, which led authorities to consider whether the victim was a disabled veteran or if the perp had been in the military. This avenue of investigation ultimately came to nothing as well. Despite the massive investigative effort, the Placer County John Doe case went cold. The victim's body was held in a Sacramento County morgue refrigerator for 8 months after the slaying, as authorities waited and hoped that someone would come forward to identify him. Unfortunately, no family member, caregiver, or acquaintance ever did. So in my view, this is a case that could be readily resolved with a little bit of work from those wizards we call forensic genetic genealogists. And unlike on most cold cases I talk about, I actually have really positive news to report here. Othram, the leading service provider for genetic genealogy, confirmed in a February 2025 post on the Websleuths forum that they are taking a look into this case. That said, at present, it isn't known if DNA evidence has been preserved, and the victim was buried in a pauper's grave, which may be difficult to locate. Also, funding is a major issue for cases like these that have been virtually forgotten. So if you want to see justice for people like the Placer County John Doe, consider supporting something like the DNA Doe Project, or your local equivalent. Susan Walsh was a 36-year-old writer, mother, and freelance journalist who vanished on July 16, 1996 under mysterious circumstances. That afternoon, she left her home in Nutley, New Jersey to run errands and make a phone call, promising to return within half an hour, but she never came back. Walsh's disappearance quickly made headlines, with sensational media speculation linking her fate to the Russian mafia and even an underground vampire subculture. Susan Walsh's early life was marked by both adversity and ambition. Born in 1960 and raised in New Jersey, she endured a very difficult childhood in a broken home. Despite these challenges, she nurtured dreams of becoming a writer or poet. In her late teens and early 20s, Walsh struggled with substance abuse and worked as a dancer to support herself. She used the money she earned dancing to put herself through college, attending William Patterson University to study English and writing. Walsh managed to overcome her early struggles with addiction and graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1988. In 1984, Susan married Mark Walsh, who was notably the brother of Eagles guitarist Joe Walsh, and the couple had a son, David, born in 1985. By all accounts, Susan was a devoted mother. Friends recall that her son and her writing career were the two most important parts of her life. During the late 1980s, Walsh stayed sober and focused on her family and budding journalism work. However, her marriage eventually deteriorated. She and Mark separated in the early 1990s, leaving Susan as a single mother struggling to make ends meet. Her freelance writing assignments didn't pay enough to support herself and her young son, so Walsh returned to working as a dancer in addition to writing. By the mid-1990s, Susan Walsh was still juggling multiple roles. She was living in a small apartment in Nutley with her son, while her former husband resided in a downstairs unit of the same building. Ever determined to improve her situation, Walsh enrolled in a master's program in English at New York University, which she had about halfway completed by 1996. Friends later noted that around this time Walsh showed signs of relapsing into substance issues after over a decade of sobriety. In the early 1990s, Susan Walsh managed to land an internship, and later freelance assignments, at the Village Voice, an influential alternative New York City newspaper. Drawing on her insider knowledge of the seedy underbelly of the city, she was tasked with investigating the industry. Walsh soon broke a major story exposing how Russian mobsters in New Jersey were forcing trafficked women to work in clubs against their will. According to colleagues, Walsh received serious threats after the article was published, suggesting that some subjects of her reporting were not pleased to see their activities exposed. Undeterred, Susan took on another dark investigative project, this time immersing herself in New York's gothic vampire subculture. She frequented underground vampire-themed nightclubs and even began dating a man who claimed to be one of the undead, all in service of writing an article about this strange scene. However, as she pursued the vampire story, friends observed that Susan started to lose her journalistic objectivity, perhaps becoming too personally involved. In the end, the Village Voice decided not to publish Walsh's vampire article, reportedly due to concerns about the piece's objectivity. This disappointment coincided with Susan returning to dancing more regularly. By the summer of 1996, Walsh was under considerable strain. Friends later recalled that Susan felt she was in danger in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. On July 14th, just 2 days before she went missing, Walsh mentioned having a stalker and spoke openly about her deteriorating state. She was physically unwell, claiming to have bronchitis, emphysema, and an ulcer, and she admitted to feeling deeply depressed, describing herself as just holding on to life. Her brother, Arthur Merchant, recalled phone conversations weeks before she vanished, where Susan seemed out of it and distracted. Arthur reported her rambling about odd plans like going to Las Vegas to look for a government job, which made him worry about her mental state. On July 16, 1996, Susan Walsh vanished without a trace. That day, she was at her apartment on Washington Street in Nutley, New Jersey, where she lived with her 11-year-old son. She left in the early afternoon, telling her ex-husband, who lived in the downstairs unit, that she needed to make a quick phone call and run a few errands. Walsh walked to a payphone located across the street from her building, leaving her son in his father's care and leaving behind crucial personal belongings such as her purse, keys, and pager. These items, along with her statement that she'd be back in about 30 minutes, indicated she fully intended to return home shortly. At some point after stepping out to make the call, Walsh disappeared. She never came back to the apartment, and no one reported seeing exactly what happened to her that afternoon. When Susan failed to return, her family grew alarmed. By the following day, July 17th, she was officially reported missing. Investigators attempting to trace her steps hit immediate roadblocks. The payphone she had intended to use yielded no clues. Phone company records from that day were incomplete, and Bell Atlantic couldn't determine whether any calls were made or received by Walsh at the payphone. There were also no witnesses who definitively saw an abduction or struggle. It was as if Susan Walsh had simply vanished into thin air during a routine errand. The Nutley Police Department launched an investigation, but initially had very little in the way of evidence to work with. Detectives quickly ruled out Susan's ex-husband, Mark, as a suspect in her disappearance. By all accounts, Mark had been cooperative in describing Susan's last known actions, and there was no indication of his involvement. Further, Mark had been caring for their son at the time she vanished. However, one odd detail was noted when police searched Walsh's apartment. The calendar hanging on her wall was missing the entire page for July 1996. It appeared someone had torn out or removed the page covering the month she went missing, though it's unclear who did this or why. This strange detail aside, investigators found few solid clues in Susan's home or immediate surroundings. Early on, the investigation explored the possibility that Walsh's disappearance was connected to her risky journalistic work. Given the nature of her recent reporting, rumors swirled that she might have been silenced by figures in the Russian mob or by individuals involved in the vampire subculture she had probed. Police looked into these angles but struggled to find any concrete link. Walsh's well-received article on Russian organized crime had indeed angered some dangerous people, but no evidence emerged tying those criminals to her disappearance. Further, and reading between the lines, it appears the police dismissed this, largely because while the articles may have shocked the general public, the information wasn't new to the authorities. Likewise, her deep dive into the vampire underground, while unusual, did not yield any suspects or clear leads. In essence, this so-called sinister vampire subculture was nothing more than edgy goths running a live-action role-playing session. Ultimately, authorities could not substantiate theories that her investigative journalism directly led to foul play against her. As they dug into Walsh's personal life, police learned of other troubling incidents. Susan had mentioned a stalker multiple times before she vanished. Later reporting uncovered that Walsh had privately told a former boyfriend about being stalked by another ex-boyfriend, suggesting she felt harassed or endangered by a person from her past. This raises the possibility that an obsessed individual in her life might have had a role in her disappearance. However, all that said, no identified stalker was ever publicly named or charged. Through late 1996 and beyond, the case remained open and without any further leads. Some investigators began to consider that Susan might have left of her own accord. Nutley detective John Rhine, who worked the case, stated his personal belief that Walsh was alive and had chosen to disappear, possibly to escape problems or threats in her life. He noted that adults are legally free to leave and start anew, implying that Susan's departure could have been voluntary. However, many others who knew her feared a more sinister outcome. It seems to be universally accepted by those who knew her that she absolutely would not have abandoned her son. That said, those who supported the voluntary disappearance theory believe she may have thought she was saving her son by disappearing without a trace. Over time, as years passed with no contact from Walsh, law enforcement opinions seemed to shift toward the presumption that she had likely met with foul play. Throughout the late 1990s, her case received widespread coverage in newspapers and tabloids, sometimes to the frustration of her family. Some media outlets fixated on her past struggles with addiction and her work as a dancer, implying that these factors might explain her fate. Others focused on even more lurid aspects, involving mobsters or self-identified vampires, depending on the news outlet. And others, well, this is one of those times you really have to look at the screen if you just listen and check out this actual real headline. Somehow the newspaper managed to fit basically every salacious element of this case into a 9-word headline. In 2020, Arthur Merchant, her brother, sued the Nutley Police Department to obtain the case files related to Susan's disappearance. He challenged the local authorities' claims that the investigation was still active, and thus the files couldn't be released. A New Jersey judge eventually ruled in 2022 that the police were not actively investigating the matter, effectively acknowledging that it was a cold case. This legal victory allowed the family some access to the records, although a review of the evidence didn't bring any new bombshell revelations. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe, and also to remember to hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Now let's get back to business. On March 17, 2000, a quiet Ugandan village named Kanungu became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. On that day, hundreds of members of a doomsday religious sect perished in a catastrophic inferno inside their makeshift church. This incident, known as the Kanungu Cult Massacre, shocked the world with its scale. The death toll eventually climbed to over 700 people, making it one of the deadliest cult-related disasters in modern history. Further, while the cult members were initially thought to have partaken in this event willingly, further investigations would reveal a much more disturbing reality. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God was a fringe religious cult formed in 1989 in southwestern Uganda. It was founded by two charismatic figures, Credonia Marende and Joseph Kibateri. These two claimed to have received visions of the Virgin Mary, calling them to reform and purify the Church. Both founders were former Catholics disillusioned with the Roman Catholic Church's scandals and the situation in Uganda at the time. They attracted a following by positioning their movement as a return to true faith and moral purity in a society they felt was backsliding into the abyss. Central to the cult's beliefs was strict obedience to the Ten Commandments. The group taught that to survive an impending apocalypse and avoid damnation, one had to follow the commandments to the letter. This led to extreme lifestyle rules. Members were discouraged from speaking for fear of telling lies, often communicating only via sign language on certain days. Now, I'm no theologian, but I think if you lie in the form of sign language, that still counts as a lie. But hey, that's just me. They fasted regularly, ate only one meal on certain days, forbid all forms of intimacy, and even banned the use of soap, all in an effort to remain ritually pure. The movement placed great emphasis on apocalyptic prophecy, like these sorts of cults tend to do. Initially, they predicted the world would end on December 31st, 1999, and urged followers to prepare for that doomsday. Notably, of course, the cult leaders convinced the cultists to give almost all their earthly possessions to them and the cult. And yeah, I'm sure none of us could have predicted that move, right? When the promised end did not occur on New Year's Eve, the leaders revised their prophecy, a standard move for cult leaders. They pushed the date forward and insisted that the faithful maintain their devotion and penance into the new millennium. But they wouldn't have to wait long for a new date for the end of the world. By early 2000, Joseph Kibateri announced that March 17th would be the definitive day when the Virgin Mary would appear and deliver the righteous into heaven. As March 17th, 2000 approached, there were ominous signs that something terrible was about to happen. In the weeks leading up to that date, the cult leadership summoned followers from their various camps to gather at the main compound in Kanungu. The atmosphere was one of fervent anticipation. According to later investigations, the leaders told members that the Virgin Mary had postponed the apocalypse to that day, and that all true believers should come together to be taken to heaven. In what survivors described as a final celebration, the eve of Doomsday was marked by ritual preparations and even a feast, a kind of Last Supper, shared by the faithful. Numerous cows were reportedly slaughtered for a banquet, an unusual indulgence for a sect known for fasting, signaling that a momentous event was at hand. On the morning of March 17th, hundreds of people filed into an old building that the group used as its church. Many were dressed in their best clothes, singing hymns and praying fervently. They had been told that once inside, they would be locked in and should await the Virgin Mary's appearance. The doors and windows of the building were shuttered and nailed shut from the outside. What happened next was sheer horror. Without warning, the church erupted in flames as a fire ignited from within, using gasoline and possibly other accelerants. Neighbors and local officials later recounted hearing a series of explosions before seeing the structure ablaze. Trapped behind boarded windows, the congregation had no chance to escape. The inferno quickly consumed the building and everyone inside. By the time the fire died down, at least 330 people, perhaps many more, had perished in that chapel-turned-crematorium. One teenage boy, who had slipped out earlier on an errand to buy food, was reportedly the sole survivor of the Kanungu blaze, spared only by luck and timing. In the immediate aftermath, authorities who arrived at the scene were confronted with charred bodies packed into the remains of the building. In the following days and weeks, as police and investigators searched other properties owned by the cult, they made a series of ghastly discoveries that would raise the death toll drastically. In another compound owned by the cult, about a week after the fire, investigators unearthed shallow graves filled with corpses of cult members who didn't perish in the blaze. Many of these bodies showed signs of foul play. Still more bodies turned up at other sites, and in total, over 400 additional victims were discovered hidden in various locations linked to the sect. Some ended weeks before the fire. It's clear that at a certain point, the leadership of the cult had crossed a sickening point of no return. By late April 2000, the body count across Uganda had reached staggering heights. Roughly 780 people in all were found dead as a result of the cult's deadly endgame. The Kanungu massacre that began with the church inferno thus unfolded into a nationwide tragedy. While it's nowhere near as well known, it's second only to Jonestown in 1978. The investigation rapidly shifted focus to a criminal mass slaying inquiry. Police forensic teams, though under-resourced, combed through the cult's properties, exhuming bodies and looking for clues. They noted that the church in Kanungu had been deliberately prepared as a death trap. The windows boarded up, doors locked, and fuel residues detected, indicating the blaze was intentionally set to end everyone inside. Authorities theorized that the cult leaders, faced with the failure of their doomsday prophecy, had decided to stage a deadly climax to prevent a revolt by disgruntled followers. Investigators learned that many devotees had sold their possessions and given substantial donations to the sect in preparation for the end of the world. When the world didn't end as prophesied on New Year's Eve, some followers demanded their money and property back. This provides a possible motive for why the cult's inner circle would plan a mass slaying, to avoid refunding contributions and to silence the dissent. One of the biggest challenges for law enforcement was determining the fate of the cult's ringleaders. Initially, it was presumed that all the main leaders, including Joseph and Credonia, had perished alongside their followers in the fire. However, as the investigation progressed, doubts arose. Dental records for the two leaders were unavailable, making positive identification of their remains difficult. No unmistakable trace of them was found among the dead, and soon authorities began to suspect that they might have slipped away. The Ugandan government issued international arrest warrants for Credonia Marinde and Joseph Kibateri, as well as a handful of other cult operatives who were unaccounted for. One of these cult leaders who couldn't be found was a former Roman Catholic priest who had been converted to the movement. I haven't been able to confirm this for certain, but I strongly suspect that being a priest meant that he received some sort of dental care. If this was the case, then his dental records would have been available for comparison amongst the slain individuals. The fact that this wasn't found, if this theory is accurate, suggests that all the leadership was likely in on it and potentially escaped together. Interpol notices were circulated in April 2000, yet none of the prime suspects were ever captured. Over the years, there have been occasional reported sightings of the two top dogs of the organization. For instance, a 2014 police report hinted that Joseph Kibateri might be hiding in Malawi, while there have been other reports involving Credonia, but none of these leads have led to an arrest. To date, no one has been prosecuted for the Kanungu massacre, and the true fate of the cult's masterminds remains an open question. How does a person vanish in the middle of an ordinary workday without a trace? This question has haunted the family of Christopher Carlton Tompkins for over 2 decades. On January 25, 2002, 20-year-old Tompkins set out for a routine surveying job in Harris County, Georgia. By the end of that day, he had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only a handful of puzzling clues and a case that remains unsolved. Christopher Tompkins, or Chris as everyone knew him, lived with his mother, Martha McKenzie, in the small community of Ellerslie, Georgia. He was known as a friendly, hard-working young man and was employed with a local land surveying company. Friday, January 25th, 2002 began like any other day. Chris left home around 8:10 a.m. after saying bye to his mom and headed to work as usual. He joined 3 co-workers at a wooded job site off County Line Road in Harris County to survey land near the boundary of a forested area and pasture. The crew spread out in a line, each man roughly 50 feet apart, as they walked through the lightly wooded terrain carrying their surveying tools. Around midday, the routine work took a baffling turn. Sometime after lunch at approximately 1 p.m., Chris's colleagues realized he was no longer in sight. One coworker later told authorities that he had glanced away briefly, and when he looked back in Chris's direction, Chris was gone. All that remained were Chris's work tools lying on the ground where he had been moments before. The survey crew's supervisor phoned around that time to report that Chris was missing. Chris's mother, Martha, was not informed of the situation until 4:15 p.m. that afternoon. By the time she received the call, several hours had passed since Chris had vanished, and an informal search by the crew had failed to locate him. Shocked and alarmed, Martha and other family members rushed to the area to begin their own search for Chris before nightfall. That evening and the following morning, Chris's family and friends combed the woods near the spot where he was last seen, desperately looking for any sign of him. What they found only deepened the mystery. Scattered near a barbed wire fence at the edge of the woods were several of Chris's personal items, but no indication of Chris himself. One of Chris's tan work boots was discovered dangling from a barbed wire fence that bordered private property. The boot appeared to have been snagged or placed there, and its companion was nowhere to be found, at least at that point. And keep the location of this second boot in mind, because we're going to be coming back to it shortly. Chris's surveying tools, which he had been carrying while working, were found lying on the ground, as if he had set them down or dropped them abruptly. A small piece of blue fiber was caught on the barbed wire. This fiber was later determined to likely come from Chris's navy blue work pants, suggesting a piece of his clothing had snagged on the fence. These items were perplexing but provided no clear answers. There were no signs of a struggle and no trail to follow beyond these objects. Despite the crew's initial assumption that Chris might have simply walked off the job, the evidence at the scene didn't entirely line up with someone casually leaving. Local law enforcement responded to the disappearance, treating it with urgency. Notably, crucial initial hours were lost by the work crew doing an informal investigation. Deputies, search volunteers, and tracking dogs were brought in to scour the area. Cadaver dogs sniffed through the woods, and nearby ponds were searched for any submerged clues or remains. With no sign of Chris in the initial search radius and limited resources in the rural county, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation eventually took over the case as a missing person investigation. The GBI conducted interviews with the co-workers and other witnesses, hoping to find any inconsistencies or leads. Chris's 3 co-workers all maintained that they had no idea what happened. They each were focused on their own work and noticed nothing unusual until they realized Chris was missing. According to the sheriff, No evidence of foul play was ever found by local police or the GBI during the investigation. Authorities also noted that Chris had no known issues or personal problems that might explain a sudden disappearance. For months, the case remained cold with no additional clues, until an unexpected discovery reignited questions. In July 2002, about 5 months after Chris vanished, his second work boot was found on private property several miles away from the original site. A property owner who lived right off I-85 came across a lone boot and turned it over to authorities, who identified it as the missing companion to the boot left by the fence. I wasn't able to find why the property owner felt the need to give this boot over to authorities, though I suspect he must have been familiar with Chris's case. This find greatly expanded the potential search area. Investigators combed the surrounding property where the boot was found. They considered the possibility that it could mark a dump site or travel route, but again they uncovered no further trace of Chris. The boot's location raised disturbing possibilities. Had someone or something carried Chris to that area? Or could Chris himself have made it that far on foot, despite having lost one boot at the worksite? Unfortunately, the boot ultimately provided more questions than answers, and no other physical evidence was recovered in that area. Over the years, several theories have been considered regarding what happened to Christopher Tompkins. Initially, the sheriff had leaned toward a theory of voluntary departure. He speculated that Chris might have walked out of the woods to the nearby highway and hitched a ride to leave the area. This idea was partly based on the co-worker's account that Chris was last seen walking in the same direction as the others just before he vanished. In the sheriff's scenario, Chris's disappearance could have been a spur-of-the-moment decision to abandon the job. However, as time passed with no contact from Chris, this theory became less convincing. Another angle the sheriff later voiced was far darker. With still no evidence of Chris in the wilderness, the sheriff expressed a fear that Chris might have met with harm after leaving the area. Under this theory, he may have been abducted from the work site and met with a grisly end somewhere else. Indeed, the family has long suspected that foul play could be involved, even though police found no hard evidence of it. The circumstances, a healthy young man vanishing in an instant, without a trace beyond strangely placed belongings, have led some to wonder if an accident or crime was covered up. Without eyewitnesses beyond the work crew, and without further physical evidence, authorities have been unable to label the case a slaying, or even a crime at all. Other speculations revolve around the possible use of substances, or the potential for a mental breakdown. Some have noted that the early 20s are the time when severe mental health issues begin to rear themselves. It's possible that Chris simply ended up having a mental break at one of the worst times and locations possible, and unfortunately, he perished as a result. In favor of this theory, Chris's boss noted that he had been acting weird in the days leading up to his disappearance. Regarding the possibility of substances being involved, his family has denied that he took anything purchased from a street pharmacist. That said, even if he did, this likely isn't something he would be telling his mom, especially while living under her roof. Other, more speculative explanations have occasionally been floated amongst amateur sleuths. Some have wondered if a wild animal could have dragged Chris away, or if he might have fallen into a hidden sinkhole or mine shaft. Others have speculated that there may be an unknown old abandoned well in the area. However, these theories are largely ruled out by the lack of any remains. A wild animal attack would likely leave behind significant physical evidence, and an environmental accident would likely have been discovered by the intensive search efforts. Simply put, the absence of evidence in this case is exactly what makes it so mysterious. In 2023, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation formed a new cold case unit, giving the Tompkins family renewed hope that fresh eyes might uncover new leads. However, as yet, there hasn't been any new breakthroughs in the investigation. Kajara Fraze was a 22-year-old from Moreno Valley, California, who was 35 weeks pregnant when she vanished under eerie circumstances in early 2023. Late on the evening of February 23, 2023, Kajara and her parents were driving to visit her grandmother when they decided to stop for a quick meal. They pulled into the drive-thru of a Jack in the Box restaurant on Beaumont Avenue in the city of Beaumont around 10:30 p.m. As they waited in the drive-thru line, Kajara suddenly asked to get out of the van to get some fresh air, which her parents found unusual but didn't object to. According to Kara, her mother, Kajara stepped out of the vehicle and walked a short distance to the front of the drive-thru lane, carrying only her Bible with her. She left behind her purse and cell phone in the back seat of the car, suggesting she hadn't planned a long absence. Kajara's father, Jamal, continued to inch the car forward in line to pay for their order while keeping an eye on his daughter. But in a matter of minutes, Kajara was gone. After Jamal paid and the car pulled up again, they realized their daughter was no longer visible near the drive-thru. Alarmed, Kajara's parents immediately grabbed their food and circled around to search for her. They looked in the parking lot, inside the fast food restaurant, and around the immediate area, but there was no sign of Kajara. By 10:40 p.m., they knew something was very wrong, and they called 911 to report her missing. Beaumont police officers responded and began a search of the area that night. Local authorities launched an extensive investigation into Kajara's disappearance. Early on, police classified her as a voluntary missing adult, since she was of age and had reportedly walked away on her own accord. Nonetheless, given her pregnancy, detectives took the case seriously and began gathering any clues they could. They canvassed the area for witnesses and sought out surveillance video from nearby businesses. Unfortunately, a significant delay occurred in retrieving security camera footage from the restaurant and surrounding establishments. By the time investigators went to pull the videos, nearly a month later, most of the recordings had been overwritten and lost. The only useful footage came from a security camera at a nearby school, which captured an image of Kajara walking by herself. She was heading south through the parking lot and moving away from the fast food joint. In that video, she was wearing the same clothes her parents described and appeared to be walking purposefully, though it's unclear where she was heading. Over the following days and weeks, Beaumont police and partner agencies carried out extensive searches on the ground and by air. Officers and volunteers combed the area on foot and with K-9 units, while drones, helicopters, and even airplanes surveyed the wider region. Authorities also checked with local hospitals and clinics for any woman matching Kajara's description who might have come in to give birth, since her due date was approaching. Alerts with her information were sent to medical facilities, shelters, and mental health centers in all surrounding counties. Investigators also analyzed her social media activity and phone records for any hints of her plans or communications around the time she disappeared. Kajara's place of employment and other frequented locations were checked as well, but nothing turned up. Crucially, no transactions or sightings of Kajara have been recorded since that night, and it was as if she fell off the face of the earth. In a March 8, 2023 press release, Beaumont police noted that the family was not cooperatively working with detectives to provide additional information. Kajara's mother strongly disputed this characterization by the police. In a statement to local media, Kara insisted that the family had cooperated 100% with Beaumont detectives. Notably, having reviewed the Beaumont press release, they do not say that the family is not working with police, but rather that they aren't working with them cooperatively. This is very strange language on the part of the investigators, because they're explicitly not saying that the family hasn't been providing information. Reading between the lines, I suspect this statement by the Beaumont police is extremely poorly worded and reflects the difference in views between the family and the cops. At any rate, Kara was frustrated by the implication that they were hindering the case, and suggested instead that the police response was too slow in the crucial early hours. Kara alleged that officers were slow to officially file the missing person report and lacked urgency on the night of February 23rd. She believes that this resulted in nearly all the surveillance video in the area expiring before it could be reviewed. This loss of potential evidence has been a sore point, as it closed off one of the best chances to track Kajara's movements immediately after she walked away. Kajara's mom makes an absolutely excellent point here. I simply don't see how the surveillance camera evidence wasn't obtained on the night in question given the urgency of the situation. More than 2 years have passed since Kajara Frey's disappeared, and in the absence of concrete answers, several theories have emerged about what might have happened. Importantly, investigators have not identified any suspects or confirmed any specific theory. One possibility is that Kajara left of her own accord to start a new life. Police initially treated her case as a voluntary missing adult, since witnesses, her parents, saw her walking away under her own power, and there were no immediate signs of struggle. It's conceivable she was overwhelmed by the impending birth and decided to run away. However, many find this theory unlikely given her excitement about the baby and the fact that she left behind personal items like her phone and purse. Further, authorities also found no evidence of her establishing a new identity, using credit cards, or contacting friends after February 23rd. Some believe she may have been suffering a medical or mental health emergency that night, which could explain her sudden decision to leave. As some have mentioned in online forums such as Reddit, psychosis can arise as a result of pregnancy and can also just generally come to the surface around one's early 20s. Kara has mentioned that her daughter might have been in a distressed or confused state of mind when she stepped out of the car. Under this scenario, Kajara could have wandered off disoriented and possibly sought shelter or help from a stranger. The fact that she took only her Bible with her might indicate she was seeking some sort of comfort. If she did experience a mental health crisis, one fear is that she could have become lost or injured in the cold night. Kajara's mother strongly suspects that someone else became involved after her daughter walked away. This theory suggests that an opportunistic predator encountered Kajara when she left the drive-thru. Given Kajara's vulnerable condition, it's conceivable someone coerced her into a vehicle. To date, police say they have no evidence that Kajara was abducted or met with foul play, and unfortunately, that's where her case stands today. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder that there's a Patreon available if you want to support the channel further and get your name on the shout-out list. Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe and share this video with your friends or family, or hey, maybe just your cat or dog. In August 1962, 30-year-old Joan Ellen Hansen vanished from King County, Washington. And just as a quick preface here, prepare to be pissed off by how the authorities quote-unquote handled this case. Hansen was a mother of 4 who had been planning to meet her family at the Seattle World's Fair that weekend, but she never showed up. Her sudden disappearance launched an investigation that spanned decades. What began as a missing person case soon turned into a suspected foul play scenario centering on her estranged husband. Joan Hansen's life in 1962 was marked by domestic turmoil. She was in the process of divorcing her husband, Bob Hansen, due to his violent temper. Fearing for her safety, Joan had moved in with a close friend, Patricia Martin, in May 1962, and essentially went into hiding. By August 1962, Joan had taken legal steps to protect herself, securing a restraining order on August 8th that required Robert to move out of their home so she could move back in safely. The stage was set for a confrontation, as the couple had been battling over assets and custody, and tensions were at a peak. On Friday, August 10th, 1962, Joan returned to the family home to gather some of her belongings, believing Robert was absent due to the restraining order. That afternoon, she was on the phone with Patricia Martin, who was checking on her. At first, Joan reported that she was fine and that Robert wasn't there. Suddenly, during the call, Joan exclaimed, "Oh my God, he's in the basement! He's coming!" and began screaming before the line went dead. Martin frantically tried to call back. Initially, there was no answer, but after several attempts, Bob Hansen picked up the phone. When the worried friend demanded to know Joan's whereabouts, Bob exclaimed expressionlessly, "She's with you," and hung up. This chilling phone call would be the last time anyone heard from Joan Hansen. She failed to meet her mother and sisters at the World's Fair the next day, where they even had her paged over the loudspeakers in vain. So yeah, you're sitting there thinking, this one doesn't take Sherlock Holmes, right? Well, this case is unsolved till this day, so apparently it does. King County Sheriff's deputies opened a missing persons case and issued an all-points bulletin, while Joan's parents hired a private detective to look for her. An extensive search of the area was conducted, but no trace of Joan was found. In the weeks following her disappearance, a major break in the case appeared to come when Joan's car was discovered abandoned in Seattle's Queen Anne Hill neighborhood. The vehicle's condition was suspicious. The normally tidy car was found with its windows rolled down, tires flat, and interior littered with debris like empty bottles. There were no usable fingerprints or obvious signs of foul play in the car, but its state was utterly unlike how Joan kept it, suggesting it had been dumped there to mislead investigators. Despite this clue, forensic techniques of the era were limited. Investigators couldn't pull any concrete evidence from the vehicle or the home, and no body was found. Joan Hansen had effectively vanished without a trace, and by November 1962, her attorney proceeded with the divorce in her absence. A court granted the divorce, awarding her 40% of the marital property to be held in trust for her children if she didn't return alive. Nevertheless, with Joan missing, Robert eventually assumed control of all the assets, and the children received nothing from their mother's share. In 1975, a judge formally declared Joan Hansen legally deceased, though her body was never recovered. From early on, suspicion in Joan's disappearance centered squarely on Robert Hansen. He was the last person known to have seen or spoken to her, and police considered him a person of interest in the case. However, in 1962, there was insufficient evidence to charge him. The case was essentially a suspected slaying without a body or direct proof. Robert maintained that Joan had simply left. He denied doing anything untoward to her, and even floated the claim that she'd stolen $8,000 from him before disappearing. To their two young children, Robert insisted that their mother had run off with another man and abandoned the family. Initially, even Joan's children believed this story, holding out hope that she might still be alive somewhere. Over the years, though, a different narrative became widely accepted. Friends, family, and later the children themselves came to believe that Joan had been slain on that August day and that Bob was responsible for it. Persistent local rumor held that Robert had disposed of Joan's remains on a rural property the Hansen family owned in the Kent Valley near the Green River. The story went that her body might be buried beneath a barn that conveniently got a new concrete floor around the time she went missing. This theory intrigued investigators and the Hansen children enough that in 2006, police revisited the case to test it. Acting on a request from Joan's son, cold case detectives used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area where the old barn had stood. Unfortunately, the search found no anomalies or evidence of a burial, and the barn rumor remains unconfirmed. Complicating matters is the fact that the old barn had been destroyed to make way for a roadway in the intervening years. There's always the possibility that Jones' remains could have been disrupted or otherwise destroyed in the construction process. Aside from that lead, no alternate suspects or credible theories ever emerged, and all signs consistently pointed back to Robert Hansen. His history after Jones' disappearance further fueled suspicions. In the years that followed, Robert was arrested multiple times for violent outbursts and assaults. In one disturbing incident, he lured a woman with a classified ad for a job and then held her captive on his property for 3 days until she managed to escape. His propensity for violence was so notorious that for a time police even investigated whether Bob Hansen may have been linked to any number of unsolved slayings in the region. Disturbingly, Joan Hansen's disappearance received only modest press attention in 1962, largely as a local missing person report. I suspect that if her case had gotten the attention it deserved, the authorities may have looked a little more closely at Bob. In August 2009, Bob Hansen decided to delete himself from existence, still never having faced any charges related to Joan's fate. In a final act of spite, his will noted Joan had disappeared and left instructions that if she were somehow alive, she was to inherit nothing. He also disinherited his children entirely from his estate, which was worth $5 million. This development spurred Joan's 2 sons to seek a form of justice on their mother's behalf. In December 2009, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against their father's estate, essentially accusing him in civil court of having slain Joan back in 1962. The wrongful death suit never produced a courtroom showdown, as the defendant was deceased after all. However, in 2010, a judge did award the siblings $100,000 in damages from Bob's estate. While effectively symbolic, this was effectively an acknowledgement that Bob Hansen was likely responsible for Joan's death. Anyway, I wish I had something profound to say about this case, but the system just completely failed Joan here. All evidence pointed to the involvement of Bob Hansen, and despite this, the police apparently took virtually no meaningful action against him at the time of the crime. The part that's most confusing to me is that this isn't a case where there was no evidence that the authorities could have used to drill down on Bob back in '62. Patricia Martin, Joan's friend, was literally on the phone when Joan was ambushed by Bob. On the morning of March 10th, 1959, a shocking discovery in a Tokyo river set off one of Japan's most infamous unsolved cases. The body of 27-year-old Tomoko Takakawa, a stewardess for British Overseas Airways Corporation, was found floating face up near a bridge in the Zenpukuji River in Suganami Ward. Born around 1932 in Ashiya City in Hyogo Prefecture, she was raised as part of the country's Catholic minority. And trust me when I say that this factor will be important, so keep it in mind. After high school, she moved to Tokyo to attend the Seibo Junior College of Nursing, a school run by Catholic officials, and later worked back in her hometown as a nurse. Takakawa even became engaged, but her parents did not approve of the marriage, leading her to return to Tokyo for a fresh start. There she took a job at St. Adelia's nursery in Nakano Ward, staying connected to the Catholic community in the city. Ambitious and seeking a new career path, Tomoko set her sights on the burgeoning airline industry. Her uncle worked for British Overseas Airways, and through a process in late 1958, she succeeded in being hired as a flight attendant. In fact, Takakawa was one of only 8 Japanese women selected out of 300 applicants. She was thus among the first group of Japanese stewardesses for the prestigious international airline. She underwent training in London and returned to Tokyo on February 27, 1959, preparing for her first assignment. That first scheduled flight was to be on the Tokyo-Hong Kong route on March 13, 1959. Unfortunately, Tomoko Takakawa would never make that flight. Just days before her official debut, she disappeared and was soon found to have become the victim of a heinous crime. Tomoko Takakawa was last seen alive on Sunday, March 8, 1959. That morning she attended Mass, as she did regularly as a devout Catholic. She then had lunch at her uncle's home near the church. Around 3 p.m., she told family she was going to attend a friend's birthday party in the Ushigomi area of Shinjuku Ward. After that, Tomoko never returned. When she failed to show up for work or home, concern grew. 2 days later, on March 10th, a male office worker spotted something suspicious floating in the shallow Zenpukuji River in western Tokyo. Upon closer examination, he realized that this was a body and alerted the authorities immediately. Police arrived and identified the body as Tomoko Takakawa after finding several of her personal belongings scattered on the riverbank nearby. At first, investigators considered the possibility of an accident, or that the act was committed intentionally, since there were no obvious external wounds on the body. However, an autopsy at Keio University Hospital quickly dispelled those notions. The medical examiner found only a small amount of water in Takakawa's lungs, indicating she had not died by drowning. Instead, subtle marks around her neck suggested she was strangled. In other words, Tomoko had likely been slain before being placed in the water. The autopsy also uncovered forensic evidence. Traces of evidence from 2 different men were found on her body. This discovery prompted police to broaden their inquiry and seek out information on all the men in Tomoko's recent life. Very quickly, one name emerged as a focal point of the investigation. One of the first major leads came from Tomoko Takekawa's personal notebook and her activities in the days before her death. Investigators discovered the name Father Louis Charles Vermeersch, written in her notebook. Vermeersch was a 38-year-old Catholic priest from Belgium who had been living in Tokyo since 1948. At the time, he worked as head of accounting at a Catholic publishing house affiliated with a church in Suganami Ward, the same ward where Tomoko's body was found. Police learned that on March 7th, just a day before Tomoko vanished, a special delivery parcel from that Catholic publisher had arrived at the airline dormitory where she lived. Investigators believed this package contained a letter from Father Vermeersch requesting to meet with Tomoko. In fact, Tomoko was reportedly carrying that very letter when she left for the birthday party on March 8th. But when her body was recovered 2 days later, the letter was missing. This strongly suggested she did go to meet the priest on the day she disappeared, and that the letter might have been taken by whoever ended her. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Father Vermeersch soon became the prime person of interest in the case. The Catholic priest voluntarily cooperated with police questioning, though the situation was delicate. In April 1959, rumors swirled that the priest had fled Japan. But in reality, he agreed to multiple interrogation sessions in Tokyo. He was accompanied by a Vatican representative and a lawyer sent to protect his rights. A veteran detective, famed for tackling high-profile cases, led the questioning. During these interviews, Father Vermeersch admitted that he had met with Tomoko and even took her to a hotel in the Harajuku area of Tokyo on March 5th, just days before her disappearance. He insisted that the hotel visit was for a quote-unquote consultation, which unsurprisingly raised major red flags for investigators. Despite his denials, police grew convinced that Tomoko and the priest had in fact had relations contrary to his clerical vows. Evidence surfaced indicating they had been in a relationship even before she landed the stewardess job in late 1958. This contradicted the priest's claims of a purely pastoral or platonic connection. Several other findings bolstered the suspicions around Father Vermeersch. Witnesses came forward with a number of intriguing statements. A female employee at a small, seedy hotel on Takashita Street in Harajuku recalled seeing a foreign man check in around March 5th. This was a notable event at the time, since foreign visitors were rare in that area. When shown a photograph of Father Vermeersch, she confirmed he was the foreign guest she had seen at the hotel. This corroborated the priest's own admission that he had been with Tomoko at a hotel that week, suggesting a secret meeting. A resident living near the bridge where Tomoko's corpse was discovered reported noticing a white sedan parked by the riverside around 5 a.m. on March 10th. Father Vermeersch happened to drive a white Renault sedan, again raising concerns amongst investigators. When police showed this witness a catalog of car models, she pointed to a Renault identical to the one the priest drove. Investigators later heard that the priest had the tires on his car replaced soon after the incident. This is a detail some found suspicious, as if he might have been trying to erase evidence related to potential tire tracks. Tomoko's autopsy revealed her last meal had been a Chinese-style dinner consumed not long before her death. Among the contents of her stomach were mushrooms cut in a distinctive manner. Police traced these to a canned food product sold at a shop outside a local train station, and found a clerk who remembered selling them to a man resembling Father Vermeersch. And personally, something about this aspect of the investigation seems, to phrase it delicately, a bit too perfect. To recognize the specific cut of a specific mushroom and then tie it back to a specific store and then get the guy to say the priest bought it is a little too CSI for me. Investigators also looked into Father Vermeersch's reputation and behavior. Detectives learned that the priest had a history of getting overly familiar with women working at the Catholic nursery where Tomoko had been employed. According to media reports, he was seen embracing female staff and even allegedly doing much more with some of the young women. These accusations of impropriety cast a shadow on his character and made the idea of a secret affair with Tomoko more plausible. Despite this array of circumstantial evidence, there were challenges in building a solid case. Father Vermeersch maintained his innocence and was never formally charged with any crime. He had alibis for the critical time frame around March 8th to 10th, claiming he was elsewhere when Tomoko went missing and when her body was dumped. However, all his alibi witnesses were fellow clergy or church associates, which made police skeptical of their objectivity. That said, he was a Catholic priest, so the fact that for a short period of time, all his close associates who could vouch for him were Catholics is perhaps not that suspicious. By April 1959, inside information on the investigation had leaked to the public, and attention on Father Vermeersch intensified. On April 12th, a television program on NHK called Japan Unmasked even showed the priest's portrait photo pinned up at an immigration office. Other news outlets quickly picked up the story. The sensational nature of the crime made headlines, and public sentiment began to turn against the foreign priest. The Catholic Church in Japan, however, closed ranks in support of Father Vermeersch. He never made any public statements himself, but church officials spoke on his behalf. Maximilian von Furstenberg, the Vatican ambassador to Japan at the time, gave a comment declaring his solemn conviction that the priest was fully innocent. This public defense highlighted the sensitive diplomatic and religious dimensions of the case. Internationally, the handling of the investigation drew some criticism as well. News of the case made significant waves in America as well. In early June 1959, Congressman Frank Boe stood before the U.S. House of Representatives and read aloud an English-language editorial from a Japanese newspaper. The writer noted that the priest had been hounded publicly by the police for weeks on end and effectively had his reputation ruined without ever being charged with a crime. The congressman echoed the article's concern that a man could be subjected to intense suspicion in the press with no recourse since no formal charges were filed. Notably, just 6 months after the crime, a movie was released depicting the priest slaying Tomoko, capturing popular sentiment at the time. This movie was sensationalistic and extremely popular, but was pulled from theaters after it caused an international incident and concern from both Japanese Catholics and church officials. Over the years, several theories have been proposed to explain who ended Tomoko Takekawa and why, though none have been proven. The primary theory during the initial investigation was that Father Vermeersch was indeed the perpetrator, acting either out of passion, panic, or some other personal motive. Perhaps Tomoko wanted to end the relationship or threatened to expose it, leading the priest to commit extreme violence against her. This theory casts the crime as a tragic culmination of an illicit romance, and it was reinforced by the various witness accounts tying the priest to Tomoko's last known activities. However, lacking a confession or definitive proof, alternative theories have also emerged. One major line of speculation involves criminal smuggling as a motive. In late 1960, a Japanese mystery writer, Seicho Matsumoto, published a novel titled Black Gospel, loosely based on the Takekawa case. In Matsumoto's fictional retelling, the priest character enlists the flight attendant to help smuggle illicit substances, and he ultimately has to silence her permanently. This imaginative theory introduced the idea that Tomoko's slaying might have been connected to some trade using airline staff as couriers. Interestingly, around that same time, the airline she had worked for was dealing with very real-life smuggling issues among its employees. In 1960, a gold smuggling scandal was uncovered that led to 27 employees being dismissed for their involvement. Tomoko had been scheduled to work the Tokyo-Hong Kong flight, a route that, as later reports noted, was a known corridor for smugglers, in the week of her slaying. This coincidence led some to wonder if she might have stumbled onto a smuggling operation or been recruited to participate in one. Another unresolved question that feeds various theories is the presence of DNA from a second man on Tomoko's body. Police never identified who the second individual was or whether he had any role in the crime. This opens the door to theories that perhaps someone else, possibly a different lover or an unknown assailant, was with Tomoko around the time of her death. If Father Vermeersch was innocent, the real perpetrator could have been this other man whose biological evidence was found. Was Tomoko seeing another man, or had she been assaulted by someone other than the priest? Unfortunately, the investigation didn't publicly pursue any specific alternate suspect, which, given the evidence which was found on her, sounds fairly negligent. Some critics have wondered if the focus on the foreign priest caused authorities and media to overlook other leads or potential Japanese suspects. Given the lack of information on any other persons of interest, the identity and involvement of the second man remains a mystery within the wider mystery. By June 1959, after months of enduring suspicion, Father Vermeersch took the opportunity to leave Japan. On June 10, 1959, 3 days before he was due for a sixth round of police questioning, he appeared at Haneda Airport seeking to depart the country. Alerted by immigration officials, police officials debated what to do. In the end, because there was no arrest warrant or charges filed, they had no legal grounds to hold him. The priest was permitted to board an Air France flight out of Japan the next day, June 11th. Before departure, a reporter on the same plane got a brief comment from Vermeersch. He said the church had ordered him back to Belgium and that he wished to see his aging parents, but he professed willingness to cooperate with Japanese authorities. Once he left, however, he never returned to Japan, and he never further cooperated with Japanese officials. The departure of the primary suspect caused an uproar in Japan. Father Vermeersch settled overseas, in eastern Canada by 1960, and lived out the rest of his long life quietly. In March 2017, he passed away at the age of 96 in New Brunswick, Canada. Unsurprisingly, his obituary in a local Canadian newspaper made no mention of the Tomoko Takekawa case, reflecting perhaps that he was never officially charged or convicted of anything. After years of investigation without resolution, police formally closed the case on March 10, 1974, exactly 15 years after Tomoko Takakawa's slaying. Under Japanese law at the time, the statute of limitations for the crime was 15 years, meaning that by that date, no one could be charged even if new evidence emerged. The case was labeled unsolved, and the files were shelved. In the decades since, no conclusive new evidence has come to light that would identify the perpetrator or perpetrators. The physical evidence collected was never matched to a perpetrator, and it's unclear if it's still available given the fact that the case was closed. In my view, the initial investigation into Tomoko Takakawa's case was severely compromised by tunnel vision, intense media scrutiny, and international pressure, resulting in critical missteps. Police quickly fixated on Vermeersch due to his controversial relationship with Tomoko, neglecting other significant leads. The most obvious of these leads is the evidence from the second unidentified male found on her body. Evidence was mishandled or ignored, potential witnesses inadequately questioned, and the focus on the priest overshadowed other credible theories. With Vermeersch's departure from Japan, crucial investigative momentum dissipated, ensuring key evidence vanished and leaving enduring doubts. In my view, due to these fundamental investigative errors, the identity of the perpetrator will remain forever uncertain. That said, maybe this didn't fully come down to investigative errors, but also high-level political intervention. On the morning of March 21, 1977, Honolulu police were called to McKinley High School. At 7:30 that morning, a teacher had discovered a shocking sight: the body of 16-year-old Dawn Momohara on the second floor of a building on the campus. She was found lying on her back, partially clothed, with an orange cloth tightly wrapped around her neck. An autopsy confirmed that Dawn had been strangled. Investigators determined that Dawn had last spoken to her mother the previous day after receiving a phone call from an unknown male. Dawn told her mother she was going to a nearby shopping center with friends and never returned home. Police launched an intensive investigation in 1977, interviewing students, staff, and anyone who might have seen Dawn before her death. A witness reported seeing Dawn on the campus the night before, getting into a car near the school's English building. The car was described as a distinctive 1974 or 1975 Pontiac Le Mans with a maroon body and white vinyl top, which had been spotted parked on the grass near the building. The witness and his girlfriend noticed a man with the vehicle. When they circled back for a closer look, both the car and the man were gone. Investigators released composite sketches of a person of interest and the possible vehicle based on these descriptions. Within a week of the slaying, police questioned two brothers, William and Gideon Castro, who were former McKinley students, known to have interacted with Dawn. William Castro admitted he'd last seen Dawn just 3 days before her slaying when she passed by his house. He offered her a ride to school, which she declined. Gideon, who had graduated from McKinley in 1976, stated he knew Dawn from a dance and recalled last seeing her in February 1977. Despite these interviews, at the time there was no direct evidence linking the Castro brothers, or anyone else, to the crime. Police had the sketches and some physical evidence from the scene, but 1970s forensic technology was limited. No suspect was conclusively identified in 1977, and Dawn's case began to stall out. As months turned into years, the investigation into Dawn Momohara's slaying went cold. It was only with advancements in forensic science that Dawn's case saw new hope. In 2019, 42 years after the slaying, Honolulu cold case detectives revisited the evidence from 1977. Several pieces of Dawn's clothing retained from the crime scene were submitted for modern DNA analysis. By May 2020, a crime lab was able to develop a partial DNA profile of an unknown male from material on Dawn's clothing. Detectives then turned to genealogical DNA techniques to find potential matches, though since the technology was very new at the time, progress was slow. In 2023, the DNA evidence yielded a crucial lead. Analysts identified two possible suspects who were biologically compatible with the crime scene DNA. These were the same Castro brothers who had been interviewed back in 1977. Investigators proceeded methodically to confirm which of the brothers actually matched the DNA. In November 2023, Honolulu police traveled to Chicago, where William Castro was living, and surreptitiously obtained a DNA sample from one of William's adult children. Importantly, testing confirmed that William didn't directly match the DNA from the crime scene, effectively ruling him out. Attention then turned fully to Gideon Castro. Evidence showed that Gideon's biological son's DNA was consistent with being the child of whoever left the DNA on Dawn's clothing. Absolute confirmation was obtained when Gideon's DNA was directly proven to be a direct match soon afterwards. In January 2025, armed with the DNA evidence, Honolulu authorities issued a warrant for Gideon Castro's arrest on a charge of second-degree slaying. Castro was located in Mill Creek, Utah, just outside Salt Lake City, where he had been living in a nursing home in poor health. On January 23, 2025, police in Utah, working with Honolulu detectives, arrested Gideon Castro at the nursing facility, nearly 48 years after Dawn's life was brutally taken. He was held on a fugitive warrant from Hawaii, with bail set at $250,000 as he awaited extradition. At a court hearing in Salt Lake City the following month, Gideon Castro appeared via video from a hospital bed and waived his right to challenge extradition, agreeing to be sent back to Hawaii. Notably, his defense attorney stated that despite not fighting extradition, Gideon intends to plead not guilty to the charges. This case shows the overwhelming investigative power of forensic genealogy techniques. Without this technological breakthrough, there would have been no way for the authorities to ever get justice for Dawn and her family. While this justice has sadly taken almost half a century, it's better late than never. That said, there's still a lot of unknowns about Dawn's case, and I hope to have an update as to why this act occurred in an upcoming episode. On the cold morning of December 6, 1983, a Niagara Mohawk power truck driver made a shocking find along Route 17 in the town of Ellery in Chautauqua County, New York. In a drainage ditch near the highway lay the body of a woman, face up and partially clothed, with no purse, shoes, jewelry, or any form of identification. Authorities determined the victim was a white female around 30 to 37 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall and 125 pounds, with brown eyes. She had been beaten and also shot 4 times, twice in the chest, once in the back, and once in the face. The injuries, including damage to her skull from the beating, suggested a very personal and violent attack. With no name to call her, investigators labeled the unknown victim the Chautauqua County Jane Doe, and the search for her identity and the perpetrator began. From the outset, law enforcement officials struggled to identify the woman. No local missing person reports matched her description. An examination by a forensic anthropologist in Buffalo uncovered intriguing clues that hinted the victim may not have been from the area. The woman's clothing included high-quality, expensive pieces from Europe. For instance, a plaid wool trench coat and a white V-neck shirt were both Italian or German produced, and not sold in the States. She also wore a handmade skirt which likely also came from Europe. Her dental work was similarly telling. She had gold fillings indicating expensive European-style dental care. Perhaps most striking, the victim was found to have an IUD for birth control that was foreign-made and, at the time, available only in Canada and parts of Europe. These findings strongly suggested that the woman had ties outside the country, possibly in Western Europe or Canada. Investigators also noted evidence that strongly suggested she had given birth about 15 years prior. One physical clue puzzled investigators more than any other: a single handwritten note found in the victim's coat pocket. The note was on stationery from the Blue Bay Motor Hotel, a motel in Vancouver, British Columbia, on Canada's west coast. On it were 3 lines of letters and 5-digit numbers, scrawled in a barely legible form. The letters appeared to be abbreviations or shorthand, and the numbers were written as 24233, 68301, and 74261. At the time, police hoped this cryptic note meant the woman had stayed at the motel, which could lead to a guest registry and a real name. They obtained motel receipts from October through December 1983 to check for anyone resembling Jane Doe. However, given the vast distance between Vancouver, Canada and Chautauqua County, New York, any stay could have been weeks or months before the slaying, and no clear link was found. To this day, the exact meaning of the motel note remains unclear. It may reference airline phone numbers, map coordinates, or something else entirely. Still, its presence provided strong circumstantial evidence, which indicated a connection between the victim or perpetrator and a journey that involved Western Canada. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, the case remained stubbornly cold, despite numerous efforts. Investigators enlisted the help of the FBI and even Interpol to run the victim's fingerprints, but no identification was made. Details of the case were published in a variety of trade magazines for detectives in the US, Canada, Italy, and a few other European countries, in hopes of generating leads. The few leads that did emerge led to dead ends. One theory considered early on was that Jane Doe might have been traveling with a long-haul truck driver. One witness reported seeing a woman of her description at a nearby truck stop the day before the slaying. On this basis, investigators thought she could have been hitchhiking or riding eastward with someone. However, nothing concrete ever tied a specific person or vehicle to the crime. Over the years, a few individuals came forward with claims or tips, but none panned out. In one instance, an inmate in Oklahoma, already serving a life sentence for other violent crimes, confessed to slaying the woman, providing details that initially seemed credible. Detectives traveled to interview him, only to determine he was a fraud who had learned about the case from a magazine and was seeking attention. In another case, a woman in California contacted police, claiming the victim was her missing friend from Toronto, the largest city in Canada. An investigator even went to Toronto to follow up, but no evidence was found to substantiate the claim. Despite theories that the victim might have been involved in some criminal activity, no evidence ever indicated this, and nothing explained why she was in Chautauqua County. Then the leads simply stopped, and the case went cold for almost 4 decades, with virtually no developments whatsoever. One tip in early 2021 pointed to a missing woman from Montreal, Canada, named Elizabeth Zita, who had vanished in October 1981. Zita's age and timeline seemed to align with Jane Doe, especially since she was from outside the U.S. In response, investigators coordinated with Montreal police and obtained DNA from Zita's daughter for comparison. Hopes were dashed when the DNA test came back negative. Investigators then turned to cutting-edge forensic techniques to develop new leads. By 2021, the FBI agreed to assist by using forensic genetic genealogy. Jane Doe's DNA was submitted to specialized genealogy labs to find potential familial matches. The genetic markers indicated the woman likely had roots in the Netherlands, Belgium, or Western Germany. This finding affirmed what investigators had long suspected from the physical evidence, that this Jane Doe was probably European. Armed with that knowledge, the team began reaching out to law enforcement and media in those countries, hoping to find a missing person report or family that might match the victim. At the same time, authorities revisited the physical evidence with fresh eyes. A new forensic artist's sketch was produced in 2022, incorporating new details and producing a more lifelike sketch. This updated illustration presented her as a petite woman with wavy brown hair and dark eyes, distinct from older, less accurate sketches. Investigators also re-examined the note from the motel. They now believe the scribbled information could reference airline flights, or perhaps be a coded reference to Canadian phone numbers. That said this evidence is still very much open for interpretation, so if you have a credible theory on it, reach out directly to the authorities. If someone could figure out exactly what this reference is, it would be a major breakthrough in the case. In 2023, a further boost came from an independent source. A missing persons awareness organization created lifelike digital images of this Jane Doe, using her post-mortem photographs as a base to show what she might have looked like alive. And yes, if you're just listening, this is one of those times you'll want to look at your screen for a moment. At present, the case appears to be making headway for the first time in decades, and I suspect that familial DNA will be able to at least solve the mystery of this woman's identity. Once her identity is solved and returned to her, this may cause a torrent of clues to come forth regarding how she actually perished. It also may give some context to the coded messages on the notepad, which may help the authorities figure out what precisely the writings mean. As always with these sorts of cases, I hope to have an update on the Chautauqua County Jane Doe in a future episode. On November 15, 2015, 82-year-old Tom Messick went missing during a deer hunting trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. Messick was part of a hunting party of 7 friends and family members, an outing they did annually for decades. That year, the group chose to hunt near Lily Pond by Brant Lake in the town of Horicon, a spot they hadn't visited before. Due to his age and health, Messick's role was to remain stationary as a watch. He was sitting on a stump near a logging road while younger members of the party walked through the woods to drive deer toward him. They planned to regroup around 2 p.m., but when the others returned to the meeting spot, Messick was nowhere to be found. Messick did have some health limitations. He'd lost one eye in an accident and had poor hearing and heart troubles, but he was a lifelong outdoorsman. He carried a hunting rifle and walkie-talkie that day, and he wore camouflage clothing along with his distinctive red and black plaid hat. When Messick failed to show up at the rendezvous point, his companions searched the area and then contacted authorities that afternoon. Forest rangers arrived by 4:30 p.m. and scoured the woods until midnight, but they found no trace of the missing hunter. In essence, what had been a routine outing had suddenly turned into a baffling wilderness mystery that persists to this day. In the days and weeks that followed, a massive search and rescue operation was launched around Lily Pond to look for any sign of Tom Messick. It became one of the most intensive searches the Adirondacks had seen in years, covering roughly 29 square miles of difficult terrain in northern Warren County. At its peak, more than 300 people were involved in the effort, and search teams utilized a wide range of resources. Specially trained search dogs were deployed to track any scent or clues in the woods. Further, state police helicopters conducted aerial sweeps of the forest, and teams of divers searched Lily Pond and other nearby waterways. Despite the exhaustive search, not a single piece of evidence was discovered. The operation continued for weeks, ultimately lasting around 2 months in some form. yet it turned up no sign of Messick or any of his belongings. Searchers found no footprints, no clothing, and no other clues to indicate what happened. Rescuers were left baffled by how an elderly man could vanish so completely without a trace. With no leads from the search, the New York State Police took charge of the investigation. Messick's disappearance was classified as an active missing person case, and the State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation pursued any possible leads. Investigators have kept the case open. As one state police investigator noted in a 2023 interview, quote, "Missing persons cases aren't closed until we figure out what happened." The unusual circumstances also drew attention from federal authorities. According to Messick's wife, FBI agents told her that something isn't right about Tom's case, although they didn't share any specific theories. Without evidence, the FBI had no explanation either, highlighting how baffling the situation was even to seasoned investigators. As time went on with no answers, numerous theories and speculation emerged about what might have happened to Tom. One possibility was that Messick succumbed to a medical emergency, such as a heart attack, or became lost and died somewhere completely hidden from view. He might have wandered just far enough off his post that searchers missed him, or perhaps fell into a natural crevice or an abandoned mine shaft that concealed him. Another theory suggests that perhaps Tom encountered an unknown person in the woods, or was the victim of an accidental shooting or collision that was then covered up. His wife speculated that an ATV rider might have hit him, and panicking, carried him out of the area. However, law enforcement found no hint of any crime or mishap during their investigation, so this theory remains unsupported by evidence. Personally, despite the lack of any corroborating evidence, I think this is the most sensible theory to explain how he dropped off the face of the earth, despite a massive investigation. After all, Tom Messick wasn't exactly in the best physical shape, and can't have wandered too far from where he was posted. Perhaps a hunting party accidentally struck him with an ATV or accidentally shot him, and then made efforts to cover up the act. If the cover-up was thorough enough, the fact that the entire scene wasn't closed off immediately and treated as a location where foul play may have occurred may have allowed evidence to spoil. And that's not a knock at the investigators here. They immediately sprung into action and began searching for Tom, clearly believing this was a somewhat standard missing person case. The baffling lack of evidence also fueled more unusual ideas, and Tom Messick's case has become a cornerstone of missing 411 videos on YouTube. These videos generally hypothesize that something otherworldly may have been at play in Tom's disappearance. As evidence for this, one hunting partner reported hearing a strange, unidentifiable noise in the woods around the time Messick vanished. Notably, online investigators have also noted that the FBI informed Tom's wife that something seemed very off about the case. The inference they take from this statement is different from what his wife took out of it. While his wife assumed this referred to foul play, these online investigators took the statement to suggest the possibility of an extraterrestrial encounter. While some have criticized these amateur sleuths' intense focus on an unproven theory, I think it's very important to note that these theories have kept attention on Tom's case. While I personally don't believe we need to resort to any supernatural explanations here, the fact that millions of people have become aware of Tom Messick because of it is a very good thing. As I've said before throughout this series, the best way to keep the authorities investigating a case is to keep as much attention on the case as possible. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Now let's get back to business. Hyperborea was a legendary land in Greek mythology, imagined to lie far to the north beyond the reach of the cold north wind, or Boreas. In ancient tales, it was depicted as an idyllic realm of eternal spring, abundant harvests, and perpetual sunshine. Hyperborea was said to be inhabited by a blessed people called the Hyperboreans, who worshipped the god Apollo. The Greeks believed this land was so remote that only heroes or favored mortals could reach it, making Hyperborea a symbol of an unreachable northern paradise in their literature. One of the earliest references to Hyperborea appears in a fragment of Hesiod's Catalogue of Women from the 8th century BC. By the 5th century BC, the poet Pindar provided a vivid description of this land. In his Pythian odes, Pindar wrote that Apollo spends the winter among the Hyperboreans, and he portrayed their country as a utopia. He described it as a place where people never get sick or old, and never have to engage in heavy labor or fight. In another ode, Pindar describes the hero Heracles traveling to Hyperborea, chasing a doe, a deer, a female deer, beyond the Danube. The historian Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC, provided the earliest surviving prose account of the Hyperboreans. Herodotus reported that the Hyperboreans lived beyond the nomadic tribes of the far north. He recounted a tradition that offerings from the Hyperboreans were passed from one northern tribe to the next, until they eventually reached the Greek temple of Apollo on Delos. Despite recording these legends, Herodotus expressed skepticism about the literal existence of Hyperborea. He noted the uncertainty of such tales, and wryly concluded that if there really are Hyperboreans, that there must be an equally fantastical people living far to the south in the extreme heat. Herodotus, in essence, thus treated Hyperborea as a curious hearsay from earlier poets of bygone days, one that he was willing to document but not fully endorse as factual. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why Herodotus has been widely accepted as the father of historical inquiry. In the late 4th century BC, the Greek writer Hecataeus of Abdera compiled a comprehensive work on the Hyperboreans, synthesizing the various legends circulating by that time. Although Hecataeus's treatise on the Hyperboreans is lost, portions survive through later authors like Diodorus Siculus. According to Diodorus, writing in the 1st century BC, Hecataeus described Hyperborea as a real island in the regions beyond the land of the Celts, in the broad ocean to the far north. This island was said to be no smaller than Sicily, extremely fertile with a mild climate that yielded 2 harvests per year. Hecataeus linked Hyperborea closely with Apollo's worship. He wrote that the god's mother Leto was born on this island, and that the Hyperboreans honored Apollo above all other gods. The island supposedly housed a magnificent circular temple of Apollo, adorned with many offerings, and its inhabitants, acting as the god's priests, continuously sang and played lyres. Some scholars believe this description was an early attempt to identify Hyperborea with a specific place. For instance, the large island beyond Gaul could correspond to Britain, especially given the references to a circular temple which later writers even compared to Stonehenge. The British Isles are extremely fertile, and the climate is mild, especially relative to where it is geographically. Whether or not Hecataeus literally meant Britain, his portrayal treated Hyperborea as a tangible northern land, blending myth with geographic speculation. Writers of the Roman era continued to refer to Hyperborea, often echoing earlier Greek notions. Roman poets and scholars used Hyperborean as a byword for the extreme north, or an idealized faraway people. For example, the poet Virgil and the statesman Cicero both alluded to the Hyperboreans when speaking of an exceedingly remote, blissful place. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, from the 1st century AD, mentions the Hyperboreans as a people living far to the north, allegedly reaching ages of up to 1,000 years. As knowledge of the world expanded, later writers tried to reconcile the Hyperborea legend with real geography. In the 2nd century AD, writers attempted to tie the Ural Mountains in what is now Russia to the legend. and various steppe peoples, such as the Scythians, were roped into the legend. Modern scholarship generally views Hyperborea as a blend of myth and limited ancient knowledge of northern lands. Historians note that Greek contact with peoples north of the Black Sea and along the Danube in the early Iron Age may have inspired elements of the Hyperborean legend. Amber trade routes from the Baltic and reports of strange lands of midnight sun likely filtered down to the Mediterranean, seeding the idea of a far-off land where the sun barely sets. The legend that the sun rose and set only once a year in Hyperborea has invited comparisons to the Arctic Circle, where polar day and night each last 6 months. Mainstream historians tend to conclude that Hyperborea was not a specific place, but rather a symbolic composite. It was a reflection of Greek encounters with distant tribes, combined with imagination about lands of perpetual light and plenty beyond the north wind. That said, personally, I'm partial to the theory that it may have described the British Isles, even if this theory isn't widely accepted.